It was a typical Thursday afternoon when Officer Reynolds pulled the car over. The teen had been driving erratically, weaving in and out of lanes, and speeding without any regard for the rules. As Reynolds flicked on the siren, his thoughts drifted for a split second to the days when his own son would have been the same age, reckless, eager to prove himself. The feeling was fleeting, but it was enough to stir something deep inside him. When the car finally came to a stop, Reynolds stepped out of his patrol car. The hot sun hit his face, but it didn't distract him from the figure stepping out of the vehicle. The teenager had a swagger about him, confidence tinged with something else, something familiar. Reynolds moved closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He noticed the boy's eyes first, wide and expressive, but the familiarity was in his features, his hair, even the way he moved. For a brief second, Reynolds felt his breath catch in his throat. This boy, this stranger, looked so much like his son, the son he lost years ago. It was as though the boy had stepped right out of his past. "Is there a problem, officer?" the teen asked, his voice shaking slightly, but his eyes locked onto Reynolds in a way that unsettled him. Reynolds cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "You were speeding and weaving in traffic," he said, though his words sounded hollow. He could barely focus on the situation at hand. The resemblance was too strong. As the boy fumbled to find his driver's license, Reynolds felt his mind racing. Is it possible? The thought crossed his mind before he could stop it. The boy couldn't be his son, could he? His son had died years ago, a tragic accident that had left Reynolds broken. Yet, this boy, this young man, was the spitting image of the child he had lost. Reynolds shook his head, trying to snap out of it. He had to focus on the task at hand. "License and registration," he said again, his voice steadying. The teen handed over his papers, and for a moment, Reynolds tried to breathe through the rising tide of emotions in his chest. He glanced at the name on the license, but it told him nothing. The boy didn't look familiar beyond his face, no memories of family gatherings or old photos, just the haunting resemblance to his own flesh and blood. "Do you live around here?" Reynolds asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. He felt absurd for asking, as if somehow the boy's address would answer the question that had lodged itself in Reynolds' mind. The teen hesitated before answering, as though he too sensed the unusual tension in the air. "I moved here recently," he said. "Been living with my mom." Reynolds nodded, but the gears in his mind were turning furiously. Could it be a coincidence? He looked back at the boy, then glanced down at his own hands, trying to steady them. No, this couldn't be happening. It was irrational, but it felt so real. "Where are you headed?" Reynolds asked, trying to sound like a cop, trying to keep the situation normal. "I was just heading home," the boy answered, his eyes still not meeting Reynolds directly. "I was a little upset." Reynolds frowned, sensing something in the boy's voice that didn't match his carefree attitude. The officer, still staring at him, couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on here, something far more than just a routine traffic stop. He suddenly realized that he wasn't just looking at a teenager who had made a mistake, he was staring at someone who looked exactly like the son he had lost all those years ago. "Is everything all right?" Reynolds asked, his voice unintentionally soft. The boy nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Reynolds there was a lot more to this young man than what met the eye. The cop stood still, his gaze fixed on the teenager, unable to look away. As the boy spoke to him, explaining his situation, Reynolds' mind whirled with questions. Why did he look so much like my son? But it was impossible, right? He couldn't be the same person. He watched as the boy got back in his car, still talking, still oblivious to the turmoil within Reynolds. The officer let him go with a warning, but as the car pulled away, Reynolds felt his heart pound louder. His mind was flooded with memories of his son, memories that he had pushed aside for so long. He couldn't stop thinking about the resemblance, the eerie sense of fate that tugged at him. What was going on? He felt the need to know more, but how could he? It was all too strange, too unsettling. Reynolds watched the car disappear down the road, a strange mixture of hope and fear stirring in his chest. Something told him that this encounter wasn't just a random stop. Something told him that it was the beginning of something that would shake his entire world to its core. He stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts consumed by the mystery of the teen. And then, before he could make sense of it all, he realized one thing: this wasn't over. The truth was out there, and Reynolds was going to find it. The sun had long set by the time Officer Reynolds returned home, but the unsettling image of the young teen's face was still fresh in his mind. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the boy was more than just a stranger, a reflection of a life that Reynolds had once known. The longer he thought about it, the more irrational it seemed. After all, how could a teenager, a stranger, possibly be connected to his own son? But Reynolds couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that had settled in his chest. The resemblance was undeniable, like staring at a ghost. The way the boy looked at him, the way he carried himself, it was all too familiar. The same posture, the same eyes. If he were to close his eyes, he could almost imagine his son standing there. But his son was gone. Dead. Trying to push the thoughts from his mind, Reynolds decided to take action. It was just a coincidence. He had to believe that. He couldn't spend his life chasing ghosts. Yet, curiosity tugged at him, and after a restless night of sleep, Reynolds found himself sitting in his car early the next morning, parked just outside the address the boy had given him. The same place he'd told the officer he was living with his mother. Reynolds had never been one to spy on people, but today, something was different. Today, his need for answers was far stronger than his sense of personal boundaries. He couldn't stop himself from wondering, was this just some strange twist of fate, or was there something more? As he sat in his car, observing the house, he began to notice things he hadn't before. The house wasn't very big, but it was tidy, well kept, clearly someone took pride in it. It looked like the home of a single mother, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. He had seen plenty of families in similar situations, just trying to get by, struggling in their own ways. Still, Reynolds felt a stirring inside. Was he really just another man trying to dig into someone's life? Or was there a legitimate reason why he couldn't let this go? He took a deep breath, deciding it was time to act. He drove around the block, parked at a distance, and waited. His gut told him that the answers were hidden somewhere here, and he wasn't going to leave until he found them. It was nearly an hour before the boy emerged, looking as carefree as he had the day before. He stepped out of the front door and waved to someone inside the house, most likely his mother, and then walked down the street, headed for the local grocery store. Reynolds followed from a distance, careful not to make it obvious. He wasn't trying to intimidate the boy, he was trying to understand. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just about speeding tickets. This was about something deeper. Something that had been lying dormant in Reynolds' heart for years. As the boy made his way through the aisles of the store, Reynolds kept his distance, watching his every move. He seemed so ordinary, yet every action the boy took only served to deepen Reynolds' suspicions. The way he picked up a pack of chips, the way he glanced around, everything about the boy reminded Reynolds of his own son, but not in a nostalgic sense. No, it was the way his son used to act when he was younger. The carefree gestures, the small, familiar details. Reynolds' mind raced. Could this really be my son? After a few minutes of following the boy through the store, Reynolds made up his mind. He would confront the boy's mother. He couldn't wait any longer. It was time to ask the questions that had been eating away at him, and no amount of waiting was going to ease his doubts. He waited for the boy to leave, then quickly drove back to the neighborhood. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the house once again. It was time to face whatever truths lay hidden behind this mystery. The boy's mother was the key, and Reynolds knew he couldn't leave without answers. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly. A moment later, a woman in her mid-40s answered. She looked at him cautiously, her eyes narrowing as though she had seen him somewhere before. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm Officer Reynolds," he said, offering a small nod. He hesitated, trying to find the right words. I was just hoping to ask you about your son. The woman's eyes flicked toward the street, and for a brief moment, her expression seemed to tighten. Then, she nodded and opened the door wider. Come in. Reynolds stepped into the modest home, noting the warmth and comfort of the living room. It was clear that she had put her heart into making the house a home, but there was also an air of quiet sadness about the place. It was the kind of sadness that felt almost familiar to Reynolds, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The mother sat down across from him, her hands nervously folded in her lap. What exactly do you want to know? She asked. Reynolds began, but his voice trailed off. He didn't know where to start. How could he ask her about the boy, his son, without sounding completely out of line? It wasn't just a simple question about his son. It was a question about the past, about everything he had lost. The woman waited, her gaze never leaving his. Finally, Reynolds found the courage to ask the one question that had been plaguing him since the night before. Why does your son look like my son? The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. The woman's face went pale, and for the first time, she seemed truly afraid. The woman's face drained of color as Reynolds' question lingered in the air, thick with tension. She seemed frozen, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her breathing, slow and deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing her next words. Reynolds waited, his heart pounding. He could sense the weight of the question had caught her off guard. But he couldn't stop himself from needing an answer. His mind was already racing with possibilities, none of them good. Could this boy truly be his son? Or was it all just a cruel twist of fate? After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want him to find out, not like this. Reynolds leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Find out what? She glanced at the door as though she were looking for an escape, then slowly lowered her eyes to her hands. I knew this day might come, she said, more to herself than to him. But I didn't think it would be like this. Please, Reynolds urged. Tell me the truth. Her gaze finally met his, and there was a sadness in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Your son, he was my son too. Reynolds' world seemed to stop. His mind struggled to make sense of her words, but they didn't connect. Your son, my son too? The words swirled in his brain, growing louder, echoing in his ears. He couldn't breathe. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but it was as though the air in the room had become thick, suffocating. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How is that possible? She wiped a tear from her cheek and took a deep breath before continuing, her voice shaking. It's a long story, one I never wanted to tell anyone. But it seems like you have the right to know now. Reynolds felt a pang of anxiety twist in his gut. He wanted to know the truth, but at that moment, he was afraid of what it might be. What could she possibly say that would explain this? Years ago, she began, when your son was still alive, we were together, for a short time. It wasn't planned. We were both young, both confused, and we didn't really know what we were doing. She paused, looking up at him. He was your son, and he was the love of my life. But life wasn't easy, and after he passed, I couldn't raise a child on my own. Reynolds felt his heart constrict as the truth slowly began to take shape. His son, the boy he had loved with all his heart, had been connected to this woman in ways he had never imagined. His world was spinning, the familiar sense of loss suddenly pierced by a shocking revelation. This woman was somehow part of his son's past. Your son and I, we were only together briefly. But that brief time, it left a mark on both of us. She looked away, as though she were struggling with the weight of the memories. I couldn't keep the baby. I was young, and I wasn't in a good place. So, I gave him up. I never told anyone. Reynolds sat there in stunned silence, unable to grasp the full scope of what she was saying. The boy, the one he had just met, was his son. But not in the way he had ever imagined. His son had lived, had been raised by another woman, with no knowledge of Reynolds or the father he had lost. And now, that son had come back into his life, not as a child, but as a young man, full of questions and mysteries that Reynolds wasn't prepared to face. "How could you keep this from me?" Reynolds' voice broke through the silence, filled with pain and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to, but I couldn't," she replied softly. "I was afraid of what you would think of me. I thought it was best for everyone if the past stayed buried. And after your son died, I thought I could move on, forget about it. But I never did. I couldn't." Reynolds ran a hand through his hair, the shock of her words setting in, but his heart was too full of emotion to make sense of it all. His son was gone, and this woman had kept the truth hidden all these years. And now, the son he thought was lost forever had appeared, not as the child he once knew, but as a teenager with his own life, his own pain. He looked back at her, the anger bubbling up inside. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't I get a chance to know him?" The woman's face crumpled as she broke into quiet sobs. "I didn't know how. You were grieving, and I didn't want to bring more pain into your life. I thought it was best for him to be raised without the complications of his past. But he's my son," Reynolds shouted, standing up, his voice full of emotion. "He's my flesh and blood. I had a right to know." She looked up at him, her face pale. "I know. I know you did. But I didn't have the strength to face you then, and I still don't. I'm so sorry." Reynolds felt his hands tremble as he gripped the edge of the chair. His son. The boy he had thought was lost forever. And now, here he was, standing in front of him, not the child he had known, but a stranger who shared his blood. "Where is he now?" Reynolds asked, his voice softening, though his heart was still heavy with emotion. "At the grocery store," she answered. "I don't know if he's ready to hear the truth. I don't know if any of us are ready." Reynolds took a deep breath, his mind whirling with the shock of it all. There was so much to process, so many questions left unanswered. But one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away now. He had to find the boy. He had to know if it was truly his son. He nodded, a decision forming in his mind. "I need to see him. I need to talk to him." Reynolds left the woman's house in a daze. The air outside seemed to be pressing in on him, thick and heavy, as if the weight of the truth had seeped into everything around him. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just learned. His son, the son he had thought was lost forever, was alive. But there was more to the story, so much more that Reynolds couldn't yet grasp. He had been right to wonder if this boy was connected to his son, but now that the truth had been spoken, he wasn't sure how to handle it. He drove slowly, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could still feel the shock of hearing the woman's confession, her voice trembling with regret and guilt. She had kept the secret for all these years, kept his son's existence hidden from him, and now, in a moment of desperation, she had told him everything. It wasn't just that she had kept the boy from him, no, it was the sheer depth of her secret. She had given him up for adoption, never telling Reynolds about the child they had created together. She had raised him, alone, and when Reynolds lost his own son to a tragic accident, she never once came forward. She had allowed him to mourn the loss of a child that wasn't truly gone. He had been out there, living a life of his own, unaware of his true heritage. Reynolds turned onto the street where the boy had gone, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he needed to speak to him, to look him in the eyes and see if this revelation meant anything to him. He couldn't just walk away now, not after everything. When Reynolds parked his car near the grocery store, he saw the boy just a few steps ahead. The teen was walking slowly, his head down, lost in his thoughts. As Reynolds got out of the car and approached, he felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. How would the boy react when he learned the truth? Would he even believe it? The boy looked up and saw the officer standing there. His expression was guarded, but there was an unfamiliar tension in his eyes, something that hadn't been there the day before. Reynolds cleared his throat and took a few steps closer. "Hey," the officer called gently, his voice steady but laced with the emotions he was trying to control. I need to talk to you. The boy frowned, pausing for a moment as though weighing his options. But he didn't turn and run, which Reynolds took as a sign of trust, or at least curiosity. The officer's words had struck something deep inside the boy, and Reynolds didn't know if it was fear, confusion, or something else that was pushing him to listen. I think you already know who I am, Reynolds continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. And I think you need to know something. Something important. The teen looked at him, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice still hesitant but more uncertain now. Reynolds took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. You're my son, he said simply, but the words felt so heavy as they left his mouth. I don't know how, but the woman you're living with, she's your mother, and I'm your father. The teen stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his face twisted, struggling to understand the absurdity of the situation. What? The boy finally managed, his voice cracking. No. That's impossible. You're just some cop. Why are you saying this? Reynolds' chest tightened, but he refused to back down. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. I just found out. Your mother, she told me. You've been living with her for all these years, and I had no idea. But now that I've seen you, talked to you, I know. You're my son. The boy shook his head, stepping back as though he couldn't quite process what Reynolds was saying. I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but I don't have time for this. My real dad's out there. I don't need you coming around pretending you're him. Reynolds felt a jolt in his chest, the sting of rejection hitting him hard. But he stood his ground. I'm not here to pretend, he said quietly. I'm here because I can't walk away from the truth. I'm here because I want to know you, to be a part of your life, if you'll let me. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The boy was visibly torn, his mind clearly struggling to understand what was happening. There were no easy answers, and Reynolds knew that this wasn't going to be resolved in a single conversation. But something told him that this was just the beginning of a journey neither of them had expected to take. I don't need a father, the boy muttered, his voice low, full of pain. I'm fine on my own. Reynolds felt the sharp sting of the words, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when they had come so far. I understand, he said softly. But just know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. The boy looked at him for a long time, uncertainty clouding his features. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the distance. Reynolds watched him go, his heart heavy with disappointment but also with a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't help but believe that this was a step in the right direction. For the first time in years, Reynolds felt something deep inside him stir, a feeling of possibility, of redemption. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up on his son. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something was hanging in the balance, a connection that had been made but wasn't yet fully realized. He tried to go back to his usual routine, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy, the son he hadn't known he had. He found himself replaying the moment when the boy walked away, a mix of rejection and longing burning in his chest. It wasn't easy to move forward. Reynolds had spent years grieving, building walls around his heart to shield himself from further pain. But now, the truth was out there. His son was alive, and though the boy had rejected him, Reynolds wasn't about to give up. He knew that relationships didn't form overnight, especially not ones that had been separated by years of silence and secrets. For the first time in a long while, Reynolds found himself questioning everything. Could he really be a father again after all this time? Would the boy ever accept him? And even if he did, could they build a relationship when so much had been lost? He sat at his kitchen table late one evening, staring at the framed photo of his late son on the wall, his boy, the one he had raised with love before tragedy had struck. The boy in the picture was no longer the child he had known. The face in the grocery store, his son's face, was a stranger. But Reynolds knew deep down that the boy was part of him, part of his own flesh and blood. After another restless night, Reynolds knew he had to try again. He couldn't just sit around waiting for the boy to come to him. No, if they were going to have a chance, he would need to take a more active role. So, the next morning, Reynolds drove over to the boy's house once more. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe nothing, maybe an angry confrontation, but he couldn't live with himself knowing he had walked away from the only chance he had to make things right. When he arrived, he didn't immediately knock. Instead, he sat in his car for a few minutes, looking up at the house, trying to prepare himself. His heart raced in his chest, each beat a reminder of what he had lost and what he was now trying to rebuild. The door to the house opened, and there stood the boy, his arms crossed over his chest, looking both defensive and confused. He didn't say anything at first, he didn't need to. The expression on his face said everything. Reynolds stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment settling around him. He didn't have all the answers, but he had to try. "I came to talk," Reynolds said, his voice softer than usual. "Not about the past, not about what's already been lost, but about the future. About you and me." The boy looked at him warily but didn't back away. "What's the point?" he asked, his voice full of frustration and confusion. "You don't know me. You don't get to just come in and act like you care." Reynolds nodded, understanding the pain in the boy's words. He couldn't pretend to know what the boy had been through, what kind of life he'd lived, how alone he must have felt growing up without a father. But he was trying, and he would keep trying. "I don't know you," Reynolds said gently. "But I want to. And I don't expect things to change overnight. I don't even know where we start, but I'm here. For as long as it takes." The boy's expression softened just a little, the walls he had built so high starting to crack. He was hesitant, still unsure, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "You don't get it," the boy muttered, his voice quieter now. "I've been living without a dad for so long. And now, you show up out of nowhere. I don't know how to even start trusting that it's real." Reynolds took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want to be here. I want to know you. I'm not asking for anything from you, except a chance. A chance to make up for what's been lost." The boy stared at him for a long time, his gaze intense, searching Reynolds' face for any sign of deceit. Reynolds didn't flinch. He couldn't. This was the moment. There was no going back now. The boy exhaled sharply, his arms dropping to his sides. "I don't know what this means," he said, his voice raw, "but, okay. I'll give it a shot. But don't think this is going to be easy." Reynolds smiled, a mix of relief and gratitude washing over him. "I don't expect it to be. But I'll be here. Whenever you're ready." As the boy turned and walked back into the house, Reynolds felt a wave of emotions he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what the future held or how their relationship would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. A chance to make things right, to rebuild what had been broken. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when there was a chance for something he had never thought possible, redemption. The days that followed were a blur of tentative steps and awkward moments. Reynolds made his presence known without overwhelming the boy. Every interaction felt like a test, a fragile thread that could break at any moment. But despite the boy's initial reluctance, Reynolds didn't let up. He knew that rebuilding a relationship wasn't going to happen overnight, and he wasn't going to rush it. The boy, whose name Reynolds still hadn't quite learned to say without a sense of disbelief, seemed just as unsure of this strange new reality as Reynolds was. One minute, he was distant, almost cold, retreating into his shell whenever Reynolds tried to reach out. The next, there were fleeting moments, small cracks in the wall the boy had built around himself, when he'd actually engage, even offer a smile. One afternoon, Reynolds decided to take a different approach. He didn't ask the boy to talk about their past or the things that had kept them apart. Instead, he simply invited him to join him in something routine, something simple. "How about helping me with a few errands today?" Reynolds asked. He had no real agenda, no grand plans. He didn't want to make the boy feel like a project. He just wanted to spend time together without the weight of their history hanging over them. The boy eyed him skeptically, but after a long pause, he finally agreed. "Fine. But don't expect me to suddenly open up about my feelings or anything." Reynolds chuckled softly. "I'm not expecting anything. Just a ride, a few errands, and some time to get to know each other." They got in Reynolds' car, and the tension was palpable at first. But as they drove to the store, Reynolds found himself chatting about mundane things, his favorite coffee, the weather, even some small details about his job that seemed trivial but real. The boy listened, his gaze drifting out the window, but after a while, something shifted. He didn't just sit there in silence. He actually spoke. Not much, just small comments here and there, but it was progress. By the time they were done running errands, Reynolds noticed a subtle change in the way the boy carried himself. He was still quiet, still distant, but there was a softness in his demeanor, a small acknowledgement that he wasn't alone anymore. It was as if the boy was testing out the idea of having someone in his life again, and Reynolds couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Later that evening, when they returned to the boy's house, Reynolds did something simple but meaningful. He invited the boy inside for dinner. It wasn't anything special, just a casual meal, but Reynolds knew that sharing a meal together could be a powerful first step in forging a real connection. The boy hesitated at first, but after a moment's pause, he walked in. The air felt different, lighter somehow, and Reynolds knew that, despite the boy's guarded exterior, he had made progress. As they ate, Reynolds kept the conversation light, trying not to push too hard. He didn't want to overwhelm the boy. Instead, he focused on small moments, telling jokes, asking about his day, offering him food he knew he liked. For the first time, there was a sense of ease. The boy wasn't completely comfortable, but he wasn't as resistant either. After dinner, Reynolds found himself watching the boy for a long time, wondering just how much he could understand about him. What had he gone through all these years? What had he experienced? The boy was still so young, yet he carried with him a weight that Reynolds couldn't begin to understand. But as much as the boy had suffered, he wasn't the only one who had been hurt. Reynolds had his own wounds, scars from the years of grief and loss. Later that evening, as the boy got up to leave, Reynolds caught his eye. He didn't say anything at first, but the look they shared spoke volumes. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that both of them were trying to find their way back to each other, trying to heal. "You know," Reynolds said, breaking the silence, "we don't have to rush anything. Just take things one step at a time." The boy nodded silently, his eyes still hesitant but softer than before. "Yeah. I guess I could try that." And for the first time, Reynolds saw a flicker of hope in the boy's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. They both had so much to learn, so much to process. But this small, quiet moment felt like a victory, a sign that they were on the right path, no matter how long it might take. The next few weeks were filled with similar small steps forward. Reynolds continued to show up, continued to be there, even when the boy pushed him away. He knew that healing didn't come with one grand gesture, it came with consistency, patience, and showing up when it wasn't easy. One afternoon, a few weeks later, the boy came to him with a question, one that caught Reynolds off guard. "What's it like, being a dad again?" Reynolds paused, his heart swelling with emotion. He hadn't expected this moment so soon. "It's different. It's hard. But it's also the best thing I've ever done." The boy looked at him, searching his face for something. "Do you think we can be a family?" Reynolds smiled gently, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "I hope so. But we don't have to rush it." We have all the time in the world. And for the first time, the boy smiled back, a real smile, and Reynolds knew then that they were on the path to something incredible. It wouldn't be easy, but they had started something real, something that could change both of their lives. Time seemed to stretch and contract in strange ways. Some days, Reynolds felt like they were making huge strides, small victories in the form of shared laughter, conversations that didn't feel forced, moments when the boy seemed to reach out to him in a way that made Reynolds' heart swell with hope. Other days, it felt like they were taking one step forward and two steps back. But that was to be expected, right? They had both spent years living in different worlds, unable to acknowledge one another, and now they were trying to build something new from the ground up. Despite the challenges, Reynolds kept showing up. The boy, who had initially been distant and suspicious, began to soften. Little by little, the walls he had built started to crack. He spent more time at Reynolds' house, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to talk. He didn't always open up, but there were moments when he let his guard down, just enough for Reynolds to glimpse the person he was becoming. One afternoon, as they sat together watching a game on TV, nothing special, just a quiet moment, the boy turned to Reynolds with an unusual question. "Do you ever think about what could have been? You know, if things had been different?" Reynolds looked over at him, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think about what I missed out on, all the time. I missed your first steps, your first words, everything. I've spent years grieving that loss." The boy looked away, almost as if he were ashamed. "I didn't mean to make you feel bad. It's just, I don't know. It's hard to think about everything that happened. I don't know if I'll ever really feel like I belong anywhere." Reynolds leaned forward, his voice filled with empathy. "You belong here," he said firmly. "You belong with me. I know it's hard. I know you've been through more than anyone should have to, but we're building something now. Together." The boy didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the TV, his brow furrowed in thought. But the sincerity in Reynolds' voice hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Reynolds could see the boy fighting with the idea of truly accepting what was happening, accepting that he didn't have to go through life alone anymore. After a few seconds, the boy let out a long sigh. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice low and vulnerable. "I don't know how to be your son. I don't know how to trust someone again after everything." Reynolds' heart broke at the words, but he didn't pull away. He understood the depth of the boy's pain, the rawness of his experience. "You don't have to know how, not right away. We'll take it slow, one step at a time. And I'll be here. No matter what." The boy nodded, but Reynolds could see the struggle in his eyes. The boy wanted to believe it, wanted to accept the connection that was growing between them, but trust was something that couldn't be rebuilt overnight. It was a long road, one filled with both setbacks and progress. But for the first time, Reynolds felt like they were moving in the right direction. That night, as they sat down for dinner, there was something different in the air. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering, but the tension that had once existed between them had eased just a little. The boy helped set the table, laughing when Reynolds made a joke about his cooking skills. There was no awkward silence, no avoiding eye contact. It was a quiet, comfortable moment, and it felt like a small victory. Over the following weeks, their bond continued to grow, but it wasn't without its bumps. There were days when the boy shut down, when old wounds resurfaced. There were nights when Reynolds lay awake, wondering if he was doing the right thing, questioning whether the boy would ever fully trust him, whether he could ever make up for the lost years. But each time the boy pulled away, Reynolds didn't give up. He gave him space, but he never stopped showing up, never stopped being there. He understood that healing was a process, and it was going to take time. Then came a moment that Reynolds had been waiting for. It happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon, when the boy came to him with a look in his eyes that Reynolds hadn't seen before, an expression of vulnerability, of wanting something more. "I was thinking," the boy began, his voice hesitant. Maybe we could go to the place where you used to take me, back when I was little?" Reynolds' heart leapt in his chest. He had taken his son to the local park often when he was younger. It had been their special place, a place where they could go and escape the chaos of the world. He hadn't thought about it in years, but hearing the boy mention it was like a spark of hope igniting inside him. "Of course," Reynolds said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'd love that." They drove to the park together, the rain pouring down in sheets, but it didn't matter. They stood side by side under a large oak tree, the one where Reynolds used to sit with his son. It had been so long since he had been there, but standing next to the boy, his son, he could feel something shift inside him. They were creating new memories now, ones that would shape their future, ones that could never replace what had been lost, but they were precious nonetheless. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "For not giving up on me." Reynolds smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'll never give up on you. You're my son, no matter what." And in that moment, Reynolds realized something profound: they didn't need to rush. They didn't need to solve everything at once. The journey they were on wasn't about perfect moments, but about the small, quiet victories, the ones that meant everything in the end. Just when things seemed to be settling into a rhythm, when both Reynolds and the boy felt like they were finally on the right path, life threw them a curveball. The boy, who had been slowly opening up, suddenly became distant once again. One afternoon, when Reynolds came home after a long day of work, he found the boy sitting silently on the couch, staring at his phone with a look of deep concern etched on his face. "Everything okay?" Reynolds asked, trying to read the boy's expression. The boy didn't look up. "It's nothing," he muttered, shoving his phone down onto the cushion beside him. But the way he had said it, so quickly, so defensively, told Reynolds there was something more going on. Reynolds sat beside him, careful not to push too hard. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." For a long moment, the boy didn't respond. Reynolds could practically hear the internal battle within him, whether to open up, to share the weight of whatever was troubling him, or to shut Reynolds out as he had so many times before. Finally, the boy sighed, his voice filled with frustration and a touch of fear. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Reynolds' heart tightened. "Doing what?" "Being here," the boy said quietly, his eyes avoiding Reynolds. "With you. I mean, I appreciate everything you've done, and I know you've been trying. But I don't know if I'm ready for all this. I don't know if I even want to be." The words hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. He hadn't seen this coming. The boy had seemed so much more at ease lately, more willing to accept their new reality. But now, it was as though everything was unraveling in front of him. "I didn't ask for this," the boy continued, his voice low and strained. "I didn't ask for a new dad. I didn't ask for all these feelings. It's just too much." Reynolds sat there for a moment, stunned. He had spent so much time trying to be there for the boy, trying to make up for lost time, and now it felt like everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. "I understand," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand that it's hard, and I never expected this to be easy. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that. I want to be here for you, no matter what." The boy stood abruptly, shaking his head as he paced the room. "You don't get it. I'm not like you. I can't just jump into this whole family thing. I don't know how. I've been on my own for so long. I've learned to take care of myself. I don't need someone telling me how to live my life, how to feel about things I can't control." Reynolds stood up too, his chest heavy with the weight of the boy's words. "I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to be a part of your life, to help you, to be there when you need me. I'm not asking you to need me. I just want to be here." The boy didn't look at him. Instead, he stared at the door, as if contemplating running away, retreating back into the life he had known before Reynolds had come into it. "I think I need some space," the boy said after a long pause. "I need to figure out what I want. I need time." Reynolds felt a pang of fear, but he knew that pushing the boy right now wouldn't help. He had to give him the space he was asking for, even though it hurt to do so. "I'll give you space," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the storm raging in his heart. "But remember, I'm here. Whenever you're ready to talk, whenever you need me, I'll be here." The boy didn't respond, and Reynolds watched as he grabbed his jacket and walked out of the door without another word. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Reynolds stood motionless in the middle of the room, the echo of the boy's absence settling in like a weight he couldn't lift. He had come so far. They had come so far. But now, it seemed like they were back at square one. Hours passed, and Reynolds didn't know what to do with himself. He had tried everything, he had been patient, understanding, supportive, and yet it wasn't enough. It felt like the boy was slipping away from him, and Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that this was his last chance to make things right. Just when Reynolds was beginning to lose hope, he received a call. It was from the boy. "Hey," the boy said hesitantly, his voice softer than usual. I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot. I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to just walk away from you. I don't know if I'm ready for all of it, but I don't want to shut you out, either." Reynolds' heart soared. You don't have to be ready for everything all at once. Take it one step at a time. But I'm not going anywhere. There was a pause, and then the boy spoke again, his voice filled with sincerity. I guess we can try this, right? Slowly. But I need to be sure that this is what I want." Reynolds smiled, the relief washing over him. "We can take all the time you need. One step at a time." And in that moment, Reynolds realized that they weren't starting over, they were starting something new. Something real. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when it felt like everything was falling apart, but Reynolds knew that as long as they kept moving forward, no matter how small the steps were, they would get there. Together, weeks passed, and the distance that had once been so vast between Reynolds and the boy began to close, little by little. The boy didn't open up all at once, he didn't have to, but each conversation, each shared moment, was a thread that slowly stitched their fractured connection together. Reynolds kept his promise, no pressure, no rush. Just time. The boy started showing up at Reynolds' house more often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit in silence, each of them with their own thoughts. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was progress. Reynolds learned to appreciate the small moments. The way the boy laughed at an old joke, the way he reluctantly offered to help with chores, the subtle signs that he was starting to trust him again. For Reynolds, it wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the quiet, everyday moments that told him they were moving forward, together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the boy spoke in a way that felt different. "I don't know if I can ever really be who you want me to be," he said, his voice soft but honest. "I don't know if I'll ever be the son you imagined. But I think I can be the son you need me to be." Reynolds turned to him, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to be anything you're not," he said gently. "You just have to be you. That's all I've ever wanted. I don't need perfection. I just need you to know that you're not alone anymore." The boy looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, his eyes softened with understanding. There was no more anger, no more distance. Just the quiet acceptance of two people who had been given a second chance, at a relationship, at healing, at family. As the days turned into months, Reynolds watched the boy grow in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't the same person he had been when they first met. The walls had come down, piece by piece, and now the boy was a young man learning to navigate a world that had once seemed so uncertain. The past still lingered between them, but it didn't have the power it once did. They had forged something new, something stronger. One afternoon, the boy came to him with a simple request: "Can we go to the park again? The one you used to take me to when I was little?" Reynolds didn't need any more words. He knew what it meant. They had created new memories in that park, but this time, they would revisit it not as strangers or as a father and son who had never known one another. This time, they would visit it as a family, with all the history and love that had taken years to build. They sat under the same oak tree, their tree, and the boy turned to Reynolds, his voice full of something Reynolds couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to say this," the boy said, his voice breaking just a little. "But I'm glad you found me. I'm glad you didn't give up on me." Reynolds felt a lump form in his throat. "You don't need to say anything. I'm just glad to be here with you." And in that moment, Reynolds realized that this was what mattered. Not the mistakes, not the time they had lost, but the fact that they had found each other when they could have stayed lost forever. Life had a way of testing people, of showing them what truly mattered when everything else seemed to fall apart. For Reynolds, this journey wasn't about reclaiming a past he could never get back, it was about creating a future with the son he thought he had lost. There were no easy answers. There were days when it felt like they were starting from scratch. But through all the struggles, through all the pain, Reynolds had learned one thing, that family wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about always getting things right or following some picture-perfect script. Family was about showing up, no matter how many times you had to try. It was about loving each other through the hard days, the messy days, and everything in between. And as they sat together in the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Reynolds knew that the road ahead would still be difficult at times. But as long as they walked it together, there was nothing they couldn't face. Because, in the end, family was about understanding, forgiveness, and never giving up, no matter what.